In the novel Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen provides readers with a detailed description of the unrealistically high standards and social norms held for women during the 18th century and the emotional toll it had on them. As young women, we can readily relate to characters such as Elizabeth and Charlotte, one who struggled aimlessly to fight against a patriarchal and sexist society, and one who fell and conformed to the expectations set before her. Although many factors separate us from these characters, the problems they have faced are still relevant in today's society, where men and women are expected to follow their designated roles and appearances, and where women still struggle for equality and fair representation. In Pride and Prejudice, we learn of the distinct stereotypes of men and women through the plot and her characters, and we see both differences and parallels to present-day society. This analysis will open your eyes to the truths of the 18th century stereotypes and expectations of women and how it relates to those we currently face thousands of years later. By acknowledging the unrealistic standards for women and where they generated from, we can work together to inform all individuals of the current and past wrongdoings of societies and create a brighter future for men and women across the globe. Jane Austen's upbringing and personal experiences greatly influenced the plot and characters in Pride and Prejudice. Jane grew up in a home where she was allowed to express her own opinions. Her family encouraged her to pursue her love of writing, and her father provided her with all the paper and supplies she needed. He worked many jobs to finance her educational pursuits. There are many parallels between romance in Jane Austen's life and romance in the novel. In 1795, she fell in love with a man named Tom Lefroy. Tom's parents felt that a marriage was not advantageous for the family because Jane had little money. They separated Jane and Tom and never letting them see each other again. In her novel, her characters face similar barriers to marriage. Later, in 1801, a wealthy man of high status proposed to Jane. Although she would gain a large mansion and more wealth than she had ever known, she declined. Like her novel's main character, Elizabeth, Jane wanted to marry for love.
Elizabeth undermines female stereotypes of the 18th century. During this time, women's accomplishments were based solely on their musical and household abilities, none of which involved thinking. They were expected to have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and modern languages. Elizabeth regards these expectations as superficial, and she prefers more intellectual activities such as reading and writing. Instead of conforming to society's expectations of being submissive and obedient, she is opinionated and free-spirited. Women were seen as property, objects that could be traded for the benefit of both the husband and the family involved. Although her mother and society pressure her to marry for status and wealth, Elizabeth is determined to marry for love. She receives multiple marriage proposals that would promise her a comfortable life, but she denies them all. Finally, towards the end of the novel, she falls in love with a man named Mr. Darcy. She is told that her relationship will never work because of her class. She's most criticized by Mr. Darcy's aunt, who says, "You will be censured, slighted, and despised, and your alliance will be a disgrace." Many believe that only a wealthy woman was deserving of such an accomplished man as Mr. Darcy. Despite the disapproval of many upper-class individuals, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy eventually marry. They continue to have a wonderful relationship, and he respects her individuality. In an article on gender stereotypes of the novel, it says, "Elizabeth's independent behavior sets her apart from traditional women who aim to please. Elizabeth is one of the only characters who refuses to conform to the society in which she lives." Charlotte, Elizabeth's best friend, reinforces female stereotypes of the 18th century. Unlike Elizabeth, she accepts a marriage proposal from a man who she has no feelings for. Her reasons for marrying are aligned with the era in which she lives. She says, "I am not romantic, you know. I only ask for a comfortable home and consider Mr. Collins' situation and connections in life." Even though she does not love Mr. Collins, she knows that she will probably never receive another marriage proposal because of her lower class, and she feels that she is a financial burden to her family. Although she is supported financially by her marriage, she never achieves the joy and fulfillment that Elizabeth achieves.
Many similarities and differences in gender roles from the 18th century to our time now. How men and women were supposed to act, what they were allowed to do, and their supposed genetic nature were all things to talk about. Women were meant to behave. They were always held up to a higher standard. Lady Catherine was shocked and astonished when Elizabeth talked back. She expected to find a more reasonable young woman in Mrs. Bennet. This was after Elizabeth had talked back. It was as if, how dare a woman should talk back, like she had no reason to after Lady Catherine had just insulted her. Men, on the other hand, were allowed to have indecent behavior, act wild and free, and it would be dusted under the rug. We can see this same standard nowadays with school. Girls are seen to be more responsible and to take care of things rather than guys. Not saying that all guys are lazy and dumb, but just that if a girl were to forget about her paper, it would be more surprising and shocking rather than if it were a guy forgetting his paper. Women in the 18th century were also believed to be responsible for housework and taking care of the children, as men were only good for earning money. These views have dwindled down, but are still held by some, as women are still getting paid less than men, and women are seen as the more fit stay-at-home parent. This ties into what women and men were allowed to do. In an article by Clive Emsley, it stated women occasionally dressed as men in order to gain access to opportunities such as military service. Women weren't allowed to serve in the military back then. Most jobs were only for men because women could never be qualified to do what men do. This stereotype has definitely been diminished, as there are multiple women in the same jobs as men, but beliefs that women are weaker and less capable of doing certain things are still held. In the 18th century, men were seen as the stronger sex. They were supposed to be more prone to violence and thought to be courageous and determined. Women, then, were seen as fragile, had a tendency to rule their bodies by their emotions, and expected to be chaste, modest, and full of compassion. These stereotypes are definitely seen today. One big one being that if men cry, aren't able to lift something, can't play some sport, then they are unmanly. In modern times, women are also played off as being too emotional or letting emotions get in the way of things. The expectations put on men and women of both eras need to stop. These stereotypes lead people to believe in things that are not true. Jane Austen's novel exemplifies both the past and current stereotypes held for both women and men. Through her work, more specifically her characters, we are able to draw parallels and differences from the actions and mindsets they held compared to our own. Furthermore, the stereotypes and plot in Pride and Prejudice mirror Austen's personal experiences and trends seen throughout her life. The trends seen in the novel accurately represent how life was back then, and by using the knowledge we have of the current social norms and expectations for both men and women, we can use the past and current wrongdoings to create a starting point for change. If both parties are enlightened of our current state of inequality, we can work together to create a more accepting and just society.